All right, welcome to video number 8 pertaining to chapter number 8, Integrated Portfolio Construction and Management. Similarly to chapter number 7, chapter number 8 is quite heavy, quite content rich, and you really want to make sure that you understand the concepts and definitions that are described in this chapter. I call it again a meat and potatoes kind of chapter. The only difference is that you remove yourself one step. Instead of going into the nitty-gritty of analyzing companies, you kind of combine all the research into a portfolio. But we're gonna dive more into this in a minute. Now, what is the key message here with regards to chapter 8? As I mentioned before, this chapter removes itself from the stock and bond level analysis into a higher level, looking at different dimensions of ESG integration. For instance, in the strategic asset allocation, across asset class clusters, within a multi-asset portfolio context, and so on. The evidence supporting ESG integration, asset allocation, fund manager selection, is less developed compared to the single stock analysis. This in turn makes it also a much more exciting area for innovation. So one of the most exciting yet least developed areas in ESG integration is the one of that is accountable for the vast majority of returns, which is strategic asset allocation. Traditionally, strategic asset allocation, or SAA, was conducted by combining asset allocation decisions to match liabilities, and was done by estimating risk and returns of various asset classes and constructing a long-term portfolio that would yield the required return at an acceptable level of risk. The chapter introduces the ideas of how this traditional investment framework could be complemented by ESG considerations. It walks you through well-known SAA frameworks like mean variance optimization, factor risk allocation, total portfolio analysis, dynamic asset allocation, liability-driven asset allocation, regime switching models, Black-Litterman model, what they do, and the possible ways to adjust allocations for ESG factors. The chapter also explains the various asset classes, equities, fixed income, and alternatives, how those play a role in a SAA context, and how climate considerations can be weaved into allocation decisions in those classes. The chapter next talks about how to integrate, or rather test, the ESG integration in asset management selection. As you know, many asset owners outsource the asset management tasks to asset management firms. So outside of operational due diligence and investment due diligence, increasingly asset owners also want to know how the asset managers integrate ESG. They do it by reviewing baseline metrics that include, for instance, the existence of an ESG policy, affiliation with investor initiatives such as the UNPRI, accountability in the form of dedicated personnel and committee oversight, the manner and degree in which ESG is integrated in the investment process, ownership and stewardship activities, and client reporting capabilities. In this topic, the curriculum provides an interesting framework from BlackRock and alternative advisors, and study results from LGT Capital Partners on ESG ratings for asset managers. In this chapter, you will also learn about the specific roles in asset management. You have the analyst and the portfolio manager, and also the differences between internal and external research. In short, the analyst's role, as we have already discussed in chapter 7, is generating views on stocks by analyzing various factors, including the intrinsic value, credit, potential risks. And in that sense, ESG is increasingly becoming an important factor itself. The PM then looks at the macro and the micro level, looks at the macro and microeconomic data, portfolio financial and non-financial exposure, and sensitivities to potential shocks to then create a portfolio, and takes into account the analyst's views when selecting the instruments. He can either manage it on a discretionary or a quantitative basis, which also then informs the way that he would incorporate ESG. ESG analysis is usually done by combining internal analysis with external elements. Typical sources of external data are sell-side research and analysis, academic studies, investment consultant research, third-party ESG data provider research, ESG integrated fund distribution platforms, asset owner and asset manager white papers, investor initiative research, non-governmental organization research, governmental agencies and central banks, and multilateral institutions and agencies. ESG is further developed in fundamental research versus quantitative research. Quantifiable ESG factors are still in development. Managers are trying to find factors that can be used as signals, just like traditional financial factors like momentum, growth, and value are. The next chapter is highly relevant. It talks about exclusions. And exclusions are important because it's the most common and most simple way of ESG integration. There are, generally speaking, 4 ways to exclude. These are universal, conduct-related, faith-based, and idiosyncratic. You will be given examples of each of these approaches. The next chapter then will look at the popular ESG indices and integration within the asset class. In fixed income, for instance, it will highlight the nuances between government and corporate debt. You will learn about ESG bond types, including green bonds, social bonds, sustainability-linked bonds, transition bonds, SDG-linked bonds, SDG standing for Sustainable Development Goals, and blue bonds. You will be taught that it is much more difficult to consider ESG in the context of a sovereign bond. There is some data that can be considered provided by the World Bank's worldwide governance indicators, but generally speaking, it's much more difficult to analyze a sovereign bond versus a corporate bond. The chapter then further elaborates on how ESG screens can be used in 2 dimensions, for risk mitigation and for alpha generation. In that sense, it discusses the difficulty to link ESG to specific risk numbers to traditionally used in finance, like variance, volatility, or value at risk. You will hear about the 2 forms of risk, systematic and idiosyncratic. This discussion prompts the question around ESG as a risk metric, which is difficult to answer. Questions like, what evidence exists that demonstrates that ESG represents a risk premium? Broadly speaking, does ESG represent systematic risk or idiosyncratic risk? Or does it, in a narrower form like climate risk, represent systematic risk to the financial system and wider global economy? If it does not represent a factor similar to those presented by Pharma French, does that mean that ESG integration is essentially process-oriented? On the other side of the spectrum, we have ESG as a return generator. Here, similar to the risk challenge, is how do you attribute specific return numbers to an ESG factor? There are case studies that show how strong ESG leads to stronger management of companies, increasing their values. But those are more anecdotes. That's difficult to quantify from a return attribution perspective. Then another big and important topic is in the chapter is about emerging standards for ESG investing, specifically the EU regulation, including the EU taxonomy and sustainable finance disclosure regulation, or short SFDR, which have been introduced which have introduced the 3 articles by which every financial instrument will be classified in EU countries, which is Article 9, representing dark green investing, Article 8 is light green, and Article 6 is traditional or other investments. The idea behind these articles is to create a framework that will help mitigate greenwashing and help customers understand if the products they buy are truly aligned with their values and goals. SFDR is a broader framework. You will learn important elements to that framework, including DNHS, do no significant harm, PAI, principal adverse impact, and other related acronyms and definitions. The chapter next speaks again about screening, negative, positive, norms-based, and it outlines a suggested process to develop an investment approach based around exclusions. The chapter then talks about how ESG integration impacts the risk-return dynamic of a portfolio optimization and the 3 ESG implementation strategies, which are full ESG integration, exclusionary screening, and positive alignment. It then looks at strategies which have a sustainability at its core, which are impact investing and thematic investing. We already touched on these topics in Chapter 2, and in Chapter 8, they are described in greater detail. You will also be introduced to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, as we already touched on earlier. And then lastly, the chapter will also describe how to integrate ESG in passive portfolios. As you see, quite a bit of content. So again, we're not going to give you the 5 most important topics simply because they don't exist. Everything in this chapter is very testable. Out of all the chapters, chapters 7 and 8 are the most important ones by far. And we really recommend you to read both chapters at least twice, if not more. You know, dedicate time to do Q-banks and really understand the concepts. You can be asked things like, okay, you know, here's the case. How does this ESG issue impact the company valuation? How can the analyst adjust his estimates? Stuff like that. How can the portfolio manager tilt the portfolio towards a more sustainable way? What does that mean in terms of performance and risk attributions? Things like that. You have to be ready and you have to understand these 2 chapters the best.